And when most people think of creating great photography, you might also think that you need top-of-the-line gear to create that kind of work. But what if I told you that the best lens isn't always the most expensive one? In this video, we're diving into why the cost of your lens doesn't always equal quality and why there is more to consider with your photography equipment than just going for the top shelf gear. So if you're someone who gets gear acquisition syndrome or you feel FOMO when new photography gear drops, then hopefully this video will give you more to consider when that happens. Something you can expect when it comes to buying an expensive lens is better quality glass and thus better image quality and sharpness. But sharpness is not everything. While I think it's important to know how to take a good photo with accurate focus, I think chasing that tack corner to corner sharpness look is overrated, and I hope I don't get any hate for this. Usually you, the photographer, are the only one pixel peeping at those kinds of details, when in reality, clients and people who are looking at your photo will never notice those things. I've done a few photo shoots with some of the cheapest prime lenses I could find, including the Canon 50mm f1.8 and the Sony 50mm f1.8. And yes, while these photos don't really have razor sharpness, that's not really the point. By using good lighting, compositions, and having a good photo shoot idea, I was still able to come up with great images. What you want instead of the most expensive lens is to look for a lens with characteristics that best suit your style of work. So, for example, things like sharpness, bokeh, color rendering, lens flare, and every lens pretty much has its own characteristic. I have used a few lenses over the years that stand out because they have such a strong or unique characteristic. So the Sigma 105mm f1.4 immediately stands out for its incredible creamy and smooth bokeh. Like, that lens is just so incredibly dreamy. Nikon have a range of lenses that have very interesting bokeh. So their 35 f1.4 and 50mm f1.4 lenses produce this soap bubble style bokeh, which mimics vintage lenses. Speaking of vintage lenses, you also have the Helios 44-2, which might not be the sharpest lens, at least not the copy that I own, but it gives you that dreamy, swirly background, which is such a unique look. Sometimes a lens's quirks are what makes your photos stand out. So continuing on with characteristics, lens flares are another big one to keep in mind, and lens flares will be a reason why I do or don't choose to shoot with a lens sometimes. So if you take a look at my work, you'll quickly notice that I love shooting in natural backlight, which means I will be getting lens flares in my work as the sun is streaming directly into my lens. One of the most beautiful lens flares I've ever seen are from the Fujifilm 35mm f1.4, which is so soft and golden and looks extremely magical in a photo. I know this is a more expensive lens, but the Sony 50mm f1.2 GM has a gorgeous rainbow lens flare that's positioned just right in the frame, especially for portrait photography. But keeping on to budget friendly, the Zeiss 55mm f1.8 is one of those goldmine lenses where you get such a good balance between image quality and value for money. The lens flare can get quite crazy sometimes, but overall, I really love how much character this lens has, including the flares. Another reason why the most expensive lens isn't the best one for you is that it's good to consider your skill level as a photographer and think about growing with your gear. Of course, if you have the means and you really want it, by all means spend all the money on gear you want, but limitations are sometimes one of the best ways to get creative and help build your skills, so it's not necessary to always jump to the best gear straight away. When I purchased my first ever professional camera because I was starting to book in more clients, it was the Canon 5D Mark II, by the way, I needed a lens that had that balance between quality and value for money, so I decided to go with the Canon 50mm f1.4. This lens wasn't the sharpest or the fastest lens out there, but it was more than enough for my experience level and creativity to be able to produce good images with. This was my only lens for over a year, and I used it for so many genres of photography and learnt so much with it. I have really fond memories of this lens. Using a singular lens can be a great creative exercise to get you to work within those limitations I mentioned earlier and to help you to be a more intentional and resourceful photographer. You'll get to know that focal length really well. It can also be a good way to save money as it really gives you time to think and understand of what you actually need in your camera kit so you can make smarter upgrades later on. Next, I want to talk about diminishing returns and what you actually need out of a lens, because once you get past a certain price point, the improvements you're paying for can sometimes become a bit pointless depending on what kind of photography you're doing. A big one to look at is aperture, because generally the wider the aperture, the wider the price tag on the lens, but there are usually cheaper alternatives to those expensive primes. So let's take a look at the Sony 85mm f1.4 GM compared to the Sony 85mm f1.8. Both are native Sony lenses, both produce sharp images, and both have bokeh that looks incredibly similar. Yes, the 1.4 bokeh is slightly bigger, but there's really not a huge difference in looks, so it's definitely something to consider. Or let's take a look at telephoto primes. You have the top of the line Sony 135mm f1.8 GM, which is a stunning lens, and then you also have the much cheaper Samyang 135 f1.8. I have an entire comparison video also including the Sigma 135, which I'll leave linked down below if you want to see more side-by-side photos, but spoiler alert, the GM and the Samyang look so similar when you use them side by side that it's extremely difficult to tell them apart sometimes. One of the main places where you will see a difference is in autofocus performance, where the GM is much more reliable and has a higher focus accuracy rate than the Samyang. But if you shoot slower moving subjects, things like headshots for example, then that's not going to be a super compelling argument to spend more than double the money. So you should think carefully about whether you're actually going to use the features that come with those more expensive lenses. And anyway, spending more money on lenses inevitably leads to spending more money on camera bodies too. It's really just a vicious cycle. One thing people often overlook is that high-end lenses are designed with high-resolution sensors in mind. So if you're shooting on a 20 or 24 megapixel camera, you might not even see the benefit of that $4,000 lens. The detail and sharpness a lens like that is capable of might get lost on a lower res sensor. In that case, a more affordable lens might give you very similar results, but at a much cheaper price point. So one of the final reasons the best lens for you isn't the most expensive one is that usually the more expensive the lens, the larger the aperture, and thus the lens itself ends up being larger and heavier than other options. So let's take the Sony 50 to 150mm f2 for example. When you look at it side by side to the Sony 70 to 200 f2.8 GM2, the 150 is much wider and quite a bit heavier as well, most likely to compensate for that bokelicious f2 rather than f2.8. So you need to ask yourself, while this or another lens you're considering might be the best, will you actually end up using it? Or will you keep leaving it behind because it's too big or too heavy and you don't want to carry it around? Take it from my personal experience. When I traveled to Japan, I was using the Lumix S5 II and I had two small prime lenses with me, and I also thought to bring along the 70 to 200 f2.8 Pro lens for some telephoto shots. Guess what? That lens is so heavy I only ended up using it twice, and once was through the window of my hotel room. I just didn't want to carry it around with me, so be sure to consider this the next time you're thinking of buying the more expensive lens. Let me know in the comments what's the lens you use the most for your photography, and I really hope you found this video helpful if you get FOMO when new gear drops that you don't actually really need. But thank you so much for watching. I make new videos every single week, so I'll see you all next time. Bye!